I'm Dan Graboy, and this is Life in Time of Pandemic. Today I'm talking with my old friend John Halle. Hello, John.
Hello, Dan.
So, how are you doing? How's your family?
Family's managing through all this. We're in a it's in a small town, so we're less impacted than we would be if we were still in New York City, for example. Though, yeah, we're isolating ourselves, and which means we're together most of the day, and we go out for walks and things like that.
So, what town do you live in?
Red Hook, New York, which
And
is about 2 hours north of New York City in the Hudson Valley.
okay, and that's where Bard College is, from which you are newly retired.
That's right. That's right.
Congratulations.
Oh, thanks.
You probably, when you were planning your retirement, were not imagining that you would be retiring into what we have now.
No, obviously, I had no idea.
Yeah.
But it strikes me it might have been a good time to retire, given that fact.
Yeah. Um, so, what county are you in?
We're the furthest north town in Dutchess County.
And what are the statistics like in Dutchess County for COVID-19?
Something somewhere north of 2,000 cases, I think, and as you get further out of the city, which is New York City, which is the epicenter, the numbers drop. So the northernmost part of Dutchess County, which is where we are, I think our town has less than 20 cases, whereas if you go further south, like Poughkeepsie, for example, it's definitely significantly more. I think probably 1,000 or 1,200 or something like that.
And do you know if the numbers are growing or declining?
They're increasing, but now only linearly, not exponentially, which is how they were increasing at the beginning. At a certain point, I guess, even if it's increasing linearly, you're pretty likely to encounter somebody that has it. So it's obviously more of a danger now if you're going into a supermarket than it was, say, 2 weeks ago, because you're more likely to run into somebody that has it. But I guess the fact that it's only increasing linearly indicates that whatever social distancing that people are doing, and there seems to be a pretty substantial buy-in to it, is having the effect that the numbers are only increasing linearly rather than exponentially.
Are you finding when you go to a store or when you're out on the street, are people treating the 6-foot distance with respect? Are they masked or are they not so much?
Well, when we go out for walks, maybe more people in masks, but generally, yeah, people do respect, the distances. Our little village here only has, I don't know, a few hundred people, so it's pretty easy not to get into situations where you're going to be that close to people. I'm told that in some places in the county or across the river, which is where Woodstock is, and that they have to shut down a bunch of the hiking trails because people were crowding them. And I think now they're kind of enforcing a limited number of cars in the parking lot, which ensures that the numbers will decline. But I haven't encountered that yet on our walks.
And it is a college town where you live, and do you know if that plays out in any way as far as more accepting of distancing, less accepting of distancing, more protest, less protest?
I haven't noticed protest yet, but there is an issue with Bard. Bard has lots of Chinese students, and I'm told some of the Chinese students encountered some pretty unpleasant examples of what you would expect from the Yahoo contingent, which is representative up here. It's about town. It did not go for Trump, but came pretty close to it. So a bunch of them left, and their stated reasons for leaving were feeling pretty uncomfortable with the environment they had to confront.
Wow, that's really unfortunate. To your knowledge, did the Bard administration make an attempt to deal with this, or was there a response that was appropriate?
I haven't heard anything officially on this, on their on the relationship with the Chinese students in the town. Though, they did, like every other school, make plans to shut themselves down. Maybe not as quickly as some schools, but they did. And that's partly because they had so many foreign students that had nowhere to go home to. So there's still some students on campus. I don't, Mark would know the numbers, but most students did leave and are taking classes remotely.
So your wife, Marka, teaches at Bard still, and she's teaching remotely
Right,
and
right.
probably suffering some of the same frustrations that the rest of the professors I've spoken to have suffered from.
Yeah, I mean, the private lessons work after a fashion. She teaches violin and viola, and that's about half of her load. Um, the She's also supposedly managing directing the chamber music program at the conservatory. And as far as I can tell, you just can't do it. I mean, there's no way of running that kind of program. I don't know what, I guess you were telling me people have done like repertoire classes, maybe at Madison and things like that. But as far as actually playing chamber music,
No, that's an impossibility.
yeah.
Right. So you have a lot of strands that have run through your life and your career. One is music, and you're a composer. And then one is linguistics. You come from a heritage of linguist, at least one linguist.
Yeah.
And then one is political rabble rouser. And I would like to talk about all three. Let's start with composer. So you've written many wonderful pieces, some of which I've played with great pleasure. And you probably have time now to compose in a way that you didn't. I'm wondering if you're able to take advantage of that time and write more music or not, or what your attitude is about productivity in the compositional realm.
I probably shouldn't admit this, but in many ways, I kind of like this existence. Um, the first thing, I confronted something similar right when I retired to what I guess a lot of people are confronting now, which is that I really quite deliberately did not know what I was going to do. So this is back when I retired last spring. So I just kind of sat down and I said, oh, well, I don't have any classes to prepare for. There's nothing in particular that I needed to do. So I had to make this decision. Well, what was I going to do? And kind of the answer kind of presented itself to me kind of immediately, which is I just sat down at the piano and I just started playing. And as I think I worked up this program. And so my project turned out to be for the summer to prepare for a recital, which I then toured around, a recital program, which I then toured around in the starting in the winter. And as I think I told you, I went on the train across the country and I ended up playing something 25, 26 times in different places before I came home, right before things started it started to shut down in the spring. So I just lucked out, which is that I could complete my tour in Washington, D.C. on the 6th of March after having played 25, 26 places. And then I came home. And so I had this recital program. And basically what I've been doing since is, well, every day I just sit down and I play through my recital program and I add something to it, or I read through different pieces, and which includes some of my own pieces. About half of it is my own music, which I'm finally now really getting under my fingers and by memory. So when I bring this out again, I'll have the whole program, 2 hours of music just ready to go, which is something I haven't done since, like, God knows, I was in college or high school. This is the kind of thing I used to do when I was in high school. I worked up recital programs, and God knows how I did it. I memorized the whole thing, and it's ready. I'm basically revisiting what it was like to be what got me into music in the first place, which is playing other people's music and then also producing my own music. So yeah, that's the other thing. I am getting back to making my own music, but from the standpoint of being a player, really doing it from the inside. And so yeah, that's my day-to-day existence is not so different from what it was before this thing started, which is, well, I just sit down every day and I say, well, what am I going to do today? And it's the main thing that I do is I play the piano and I write some music.
And you got home on March 6th, you said, or your
Right.
last concert was on March 6th.
That's right.
So you really snuck in under the wire.
Yeah.
March 11th was the date that we canceled events over 50 people at our university, and March 13th was the date that we shut down. So
Right.
we're talking about 1 week ahead of time.
Right. So I remember my last couple of concerts, there were already social distancing was already being discussed. And like, we didn't shake hands, you did the kind of fist bump thing or the elbow bump thing. Most of my events were pretty small, so I don't think that I played a role in circulating the epidemic, but who knows?
It's inspiring that you're getting back to playing the piano. A lot of your training was as a jazz pianist, I think. Is that correct?
Yeah, some of it, but it's all kind of like everything else in the music world. It's all mushed together now. Back in the day, we used to make that distinction between what it meant to be an improviser, what it meant to be a composer, what it meant to be a classical musician, or what it meant to be the jazz musician. The boundaries were, they were being challenged, but you could identify them. Now I think they're really hard to identify where they are anymore.
For sure. Do you do any improvising, or does your composition come out of improvising, or are you more methodical with it?
Yeah, well, it always did. I mean, I think of my eventual realization, which is one of the things that came this year, was that, yeah, I improvise. I'm just bad at it. And so it's sort of like extemporaneous speaking. I mean, some people are good at it, some people are not. Like some academics are really good lecturers, some are not. But that's kind of independent from whether you're a good scholar or not, or whether you're a good physicist. Some physicists gave good lectures, some didn't. But whether they had a contribution to the field was to some extent independent of their ability to convey what they did on the spot. And my ultimate realization was that, yeah, I love to improvise. Like I'll sit down and play the piano. Of course, when I'm writing a piece, the first impulse is it's either improvisatory in the sense that you actually play the thing on the instrument, or it's improvisatory in the sense that you're just imagining it in your head. But like the notion of creativity is essentially improvisatory in some sense. The question is whether you're good at it or not, whether you can actually sit down and play something that you're improvising compellingly so that somebody would actually want to listen to it. My ultimate verdict was myself that I'm just not really very good at it. So I damn well better write the thing down and then practice the thing if anybody else is going to want to bother to listen to the thing. And so I think that, that's one of my realizations from this year for me.
Would you consider composition to be a kind of a slow motion improvisation where there's just time to have one idea, let it settle?
Yeah, or improvisation where you can fix your mistakes, or you go down some route and, and you end up, it's some dead end. And the thing is that you can like go back and take the other road. Whereas when you're improvising, well, that's not an option. Of course, the great improvisers, they somehow find some way of like getting themselves back onto the main road, or the experience of like getting lost with them or something is something that you want to share with them. But I guess for people that aren't that good, it's, the experience is, well, you're just like stuck in the weeds somewhere.
But Igor Stravinsky said that the eraser is the composer's most important tool. So you're on the same page as he is.
Yeah, I mean, and also in the sense that he always composed at the piano, whereas famously, Bach and Schoenberg. Well, what Bach called people like us clavier hussars, the hussars of the piano. So he thought you should just be able to imagine the whole thing in your head and write it down. Well,
That's musical genius to be able to do
yeah,
that.
but though, of course, there are probably lots of mediocrities that also composed in that way too, right? So it's kind of independent of what your contribution is. Certainly, you would take Stravinsky's music over any number of composers that kind of just imagined tone rows or generated tone rows and kind of mechanically put them down on the page.
Tell us about your relationship to the field of linguistics. Let's start with your father, Morris Halle.
Well, yeah, Morris was one of the major linguists of the second half of the 20th century. Not as well known as his colleague Chomsky, but in the field, he's very well known for having developed basically so linguistics is divided into three parts, more or less. There's the semantics part, which is meaning, and then there's syntax. That's what Chomsky does. My father does this thing called phonology, which has to do with the sounds of language. And his development in the field was that he was able to discover certain kinds of rules which seemed to dictate the surface form that language takes when you put the pieces of linguistic sounds together. Those pieces are called phonemes. And so it's a formal technical field, and he made certain kinds of developments in that field. So that's what he did. My interest in I never quite understood what my father was doing, it turns out. Certain parts of it I did, and I actually sort of did some work in one area of his field, which is called metrical phonology, and that has to do with linguistic stress. So how you figure out where the stress on words goes.
Can you give an example of that?
Yeah, good. Yeah, so, well, famously, some languages stress is easy. So take French. French, it's easy. Just always goes on the right, except for if it's an muet, which is, right, so it means goes on the last syllable, but if it's an muet, it goes on the second to last syllable. So you say whatever, faire, but you say, recevoir. Okay, so if it has an muet, you sort of don't count the last syllable. Whereas if it has
But that's the silent E that's rarely pronounced except in poetry.
That's right. Yeah. In poetry, you count everything, right? Which is that's actually one of my fields. But you don't, whereas in spoken French, sometimes you do put it in, sometimes you don't. Your decision is whether you do it or not is complicated. But then, so the way that the linguists think of it is French is right-headed, meaning the stress is all the way on the right, though the last syllable, if it's muet, is called extrametrical, which is to say you don't include it in the count. But then now there's the inverse. So then there's Hungarian, okay, and Finnish. So that the way that you do that is the stress is always all the way on the left. So it's kind of the mirror image in a way. So you count, but then where you put the head is all the way on the left. Then
Bartok,
Bela Bartok, right? And then you always know. So you always know when somebody doesn't know music, they say, or doesn't know Hungarian, they say ligeti, right? But it's not ligeti, it's ligeti, right? All right. Anyway, a lot of examples like that. So that's Hungarian and Finnish and a bunch of other languages. Then there are a lot of, but then those are language. But then it doesn't matter how many syllables there are. You always put it all the way to the left or the right. Then there are languages that work by dividing the syllables by forming pairs of syllables. Okay, like da 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 da, and then you can either put them on the left of the pair, or you can put them on the right. And so the analogy is more in like poetic meter. So,
iambic pentameter.
Well, iambic, right? It's so you draw the constituents in pairs. right? And that's the iambic. But then the iambic tells you that it's that you put the head on the right,
Da-da.
whereas da-da, whereas it's trochee, da-da, you put the head on the left.
It's
Okay?
always struck me that swing is a kind of an iamb.
Well, swing is kind of, yeah, though, well, yeah, actually, I've written about this. The way that iambic generally works in practice, right, when you do iambic pentameter, you say da 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 da. So it's an underlying ternary, but it's really long. It's a short, long, short, long, short, long, short, long, short, long, with the stress on the, with the head on the right, okay? I mean, now already you see we're jumping into poetry, whereas before we were just talking about language. And it turns out to be the case that languages themselves, whether they're poetic, you're using poetic practice or not, can be looked at in the way that I just described, which is to say they're either unbounded or bounded. So unbounded is like French or Hungarian, which means you don't count the constituents. Where if they're bounded, then you count the constituents, right? So like twos, you take groups of two, and then you put the head either on the left or the right. Now, when you have but then you can do heads of heads of heads, right? So if you have like 4 syllables, you can say, group them in groups of 2, and then I should show you this on paper, but and then the question is, if now you have 2 groups of 2, and now the question is, well, do you put the head on the left group or on the right group? And then the procedure is, say, well, on that level, you put the head either on the left or on the right of the previous constituent that you formed. So it's kind of hierarchical. I mean, this doesn't work all that well, but conceptually, it turns out the idea is that it's the right idea. And the field in linguistics that does this is called generative phonology or generative metrics. And so, and as I say, it gets applied to just the computation of stress in normal languages like Russian or English. English turns out to be really hard. Nobody's quite figured it out yet. But as I say, French and Hungarian seems to be kind of unproblematic. Italian and Spanish are kind of in between. There are kind of rules for stress. Then also like vowel quality has a lot to do, right? Whether a vowel is long or whether a vowel is short enters into the computation as well. Anyway, that's your, I think I answered the question, what my father does, right?
Yeah.
So I did a little bit of work on that. The linguistics that I ended up teaching when I was at Bard, I taught the only linguistics class at Bard, believe it or not. I taught a syntax class, and that was Chomsky stuff, which I think is really amazing.
So let's get back to Chomsky in a minute, but I want to ask you, I want to float an idea and see what you think.
Okay.
Do you think it's possible that jazz arose as a style, or the blues arose as a style in America because of some kind of perfect melding of conditions where the English language fits into a swing feel so easily, into an iambic feel, and then some mixing of that with the right conditions of an impoverished and downtrodden people? In other words, is a language possibly a mix into how jazz developed as a style?
Maybe. It's an interesting idea. I mean, the standard line is that jazz is the African 12/8, imposed on regular European metrically kind of regular, or the metrical regularity. And, you actually can hear it like, it's not so common now, but there used to be these kind of jazzified versions of, like, I remember there's a pianist named Jess Stacy. He used to do that. That was his specialty, was kind of jazzifying Chopin, right? And so he would like take, Chopin waltzes or something, or Chopin, easy Chopin pieces, and he would make jazz. And it's pretty obvious what the translation is. Well, you just take all the stuff where Chopin would do, da 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 da, and you make them da 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 da, and it's pretty systematic. You just you just make it into 12/8, and then the first note you make long, and then the second note you make short, and then all of a sudden you have what's called quote unquote swung eighth notes. And of course, the mistake always is that people always think there's something mystical about the swung eighth note, because like for a long time it was notated as dotted eighth, 16th, which it's not really.
It does not capture the flavor of that rhythm at all, since a dotted eighth 16th goes da 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 da.
Yeah, it makes it too kind of hokey sounding, and the 12/8 is closer to it, and I think it's, for most purposes, you can notate it as 12/8, and of course, like if somebody plays it in a stodgy way, it'll sound stodgy. But of course, that applies to Bach too, right? I mean, if you play Bach eighth notes in a stodgy way, you're going to get stodgy eighth notes. So I think there's this line that there's something that the underlying essence of jazz can't be captured by notation. That always struck me as being nonsense. You can do it. You can't capture any kind of music by notation, ultimately, right? You either play it stodgily or unmusically. You just have to learn the traditions, and you have to understand, how it's done. I mean, what's complicated a little bit is that jazz tends to be notated in eighth notes, and you have to understand what the conversion is, right? And there are some things, I remember I would do this with my musicianship class, like I would actually give them a jazz tune, and I would expect them to be able to read it with jazz eighths, and you have to give them the rules for the conversion. And I've forgotten what there were, but there are certain things you have to kind of fudge, like something like the anticipations, for example, don't end up being exactly where you expect them to be. There's some, but basically it's a pretty simple procedure of converting the notated straight eighth notes into the swung eighths.
Although there's some specific to jazz or also pop music rules that are very different from classical rules. For instance, if you anticipate the downbeat with 1/8 note, and then you continue with eighth notes through one measure, and that's the end of your passage, then you phrase all the way to the last one, ba-da, 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 bop, bop, ba-da, ba-da. And that's right. So different from the feel of classical music.
Yeah, that would be one of those instances where you have to learn, well, this is the way that you do it in jazz, and you have to instruct somebody on how to do it, if they're gonna do it right. I don't think, I've always wondered, but I think there is I remember assigning this for a music cognition topic once to a student, how you can just whether you can just formally demonstrate, what it is that you actually do when you jazzify a melody. Somebody must have done it somewhere. I should be keeping up on the literature more, but it's, it just strikes me as being a sort of a problem that has a fairly well-defined solution. I mean, of course, things like this always end up being complicated, or more complicated than you expect them to be when you get in the weeds.
And by the time you solve them, there's new styles which don't follow the same rules.
Yeah, sure.
Is there a relationship somehow through linguistics and linguistic analysis of music and poetry?
Oh, well, let's see. One of the things that I was doing, that was my research topic. See, my research topic was something called text setting, okay? And in particular, it had to do with improvised text setting. But of course, improvised text setting is not a big deal because everybody can do it, okay? And I'll give you an example, a really simple example, okay? So let's take the following chant. Hey, hey, ho, ho, has got to go. Hey, hey, ho, ho, has got to go. You see, I'm leaving a blank, okay? So when you're at some protest march, you insert a name into the blank, okay? And so, I don't know, say take the name is going to be Donald Trump now, okay? So here, all right, so here's the chant. Hey, hey, ho, ho, has got to go. Hey, hey, ho, ho.
Donald Trump.
Hey, hey, ho, ho.
Donald Trump has got to go.
Hey, hey, ho, ho.
And
Donald
interestingly,
Trump.
over
So you
Zoom,
know,
we add one beat to our measure because of the delay, and now we have a lovely chant in
yeah,
5.
okay, we screwed it. Yeah, but I mean, and anyway, you know how to do it. You know, I mean, everybody knows how to. But you've obviously you've never done it. You've never. I mean, you've never done that before, or like it choose some other completely random name that you've never heard before, and you know how to do it. Right. So this is the linguistic. See, this is called productive knowledge. Okay. Just in the same way as you know in linguistics, like, you know, if you take some sentence like the man who comes at 6 o'clock will win. Right. You know that if you make a question out of that, you say, will the man who comes at 6 o'clock win? You don't say, will the man who comes at 6 o'clock will win, right? So you can improvise the correct meaning. You can create, right? The essence of language is that it's creative, that one is constantly creating new forms. And in fact, one of the remarkable things about language is that any sentence that's longer than 6 words has a 99% chance of never having been used before. It's completely new, okay? That's a research by a guy named Charles Yang, among this, where he actually came up with a number. It's a remarkable thing. So you're always creating new forms. Now, the thing about music is that one doesn't think that one is creating new forms, right? There's a special name for a person that's creating new forms. That's called a composer. Whereas in
I
linguistics,
thought you were going to say outcast.
well, maybe, yeah, in some fraction, yes, but you know, language, there's nothing, so if somebody that creates new forms in a language is a speaker of a language. In music, there's a special name. He's a composer or an improviser, something like that. Anyway, the whole point, but with text setting, I just showed you that you just created a new musical form. You inserted, you know, you created a new version, a new form, new musical form when you inserted a new word into that particular text setting. And I mean, more to other examples, the song that I Laerdal and I wrote a bunch of papers on is the song "What Shall We Do with a Drunken Sailor?" Okay,
Right. So this is Fred Laerdal, your composition teacher
yeah,
at
but also
Columbia
my
during your PhD.
yeah.
Correct?
So you know, so there's a song like "What Shall We Do with a Drunken Sailor?" And you notice that when you take that, you can insert text that have a lot more syllables than the original. So scrape the hair off his chest with the hoop iron razor, or you can take a lot of the syllables out. So keel haul him till he's sober, right? That has a lot fewer notes than the original. But in either case, you know how to do it. So you go keel haul him till he's sober, which meant you took out what shall we do with the drunken sailor. So you dumped a lot of the notes from the original song, but you knew which ones to dump, okay? So you're essentially being musically creative. But a normal person who's like singing that song, you know, in a group setting will know what to do. So so where the interface of one of the ways in which I think you can see an interface between music and linguistics is there, that you have is where you exercise, where normal people, not just composers, but just everybody is able to exercise productive intuitions for music. And text setting is the context where one sees those productive intuitions. There are not too many contexts where you actually can see them, you know, as visibly displayed in music. Whereas in language, it's just taken for granted. One constantly is using language creatively. So you
This is
always,
making me feel verbally squeamish, as if I'm somehow being controlled when I speak English in ways that I had no idea.
yeah, you're being controlled by the grammar of English, right? That's the thing that's in your head, you know? Like, whereas if you're some language that you don't know, you're not being controlled by the grammar at all, right? Which means you don't know how to speak the damn language, right? You know, whereas, you know, music is kind of more complicated. Well, are you controlled by a musical grammar? Yeah, to some extent you are, but let's just say, at least when text setting, you can see, you can define what some of the rules are for the productive grammar. So that was the set of problems that was interesting to me when I was doing this work.
That is fascinating. Let's take a sidestep now and talk about your third career strand, if you want to call it a career strand, and that's your rabble rousing. So you're a
Yeah,
somewhat prolific poster on Facebook.
yeah,
You definitely have opinions.
mm,
You are frequently speaking about politics.
yeah.
So where do you stand?
Well, let's see. I'm on the left. I've always been kind of on I'm on the, I guess, pretty easily described as a Bernie Sanders leftist now. It was not so easily, where I was on the spectrum was not as readily identifiable prior to 2015 or 2016. That's pretty much where I've always stood. And now a lot of those positions have kind of have become sort of taken for granted as what we need to do. For example, like I think we need kind of a national health. I think we need Medicare for all, right? Like people said, oh, well, it's no problem. Private insurance, you can keep your own private insurance. No problem. You can get health insurance. You know, that's the nice thing about private insurance is if you want it, you can keep it, said Mayor Pete. But of course, as we see now, when there are 30 million people that are unemployed, all of a sudden it turns out that they can't, in fact, keep their insurance because their damned insurance was provided from their employer. And if you no longer have an employer, you no longer have health insurance. And that's a pretty bad thing not to have when there's an epidemic, right? Because when you have an epidemic, you want people to go to the doctor, or at least you want them to at least be able to get tested to see whether they have the damn disease. And I don't know if you remember when this was happening, like people wanted to find out whether they had the disease or not. And their health insurance wasn't even covering it. A guy, like this was back in March, went to see when you wanted to find out whether he had it, cost him $6,000.
This, I remember the story, and it's an astonishing story, but what is the most astonishing to me is that happened a month ago, because that feels like it happened somehow in prehistory of mankind.
Yeah, right. And I think whatever, a couple years from now, it could be the case that we're going to look at this period when people were not able to get health insurance, were not provided health insurance as a right, as they are in pretty much every other country, civilized country in the world, right? You get health insurance. You get sick, you go to the doctor, you don't pay for it. That's, it will be the system that we had. We will just be amazed that we actually lived in such a crazy system. Well, I mean, the same way as there was Jim Crow and there was slavery, for God's sake, like unimaginable to us now that we lived in a system. I mean, we're old enough to remember when there were anti-miscegenation laws in the South, like in our memory, right? Like, you could not, black and white people could not get married, I think, in the state of Virginia, even like when I visited it in like 1975 or something like that. I remember somebody told me there were still anti-miscegenation laws on the books in the state of Virginia in the mid 1970s. You think it's completely crazy. How did we live like that? Well,
So do you feel like in some way the COVID-19 pandemic is pushing the country to the left? And I ask that because times of crisis, countries often respond to times of crisis with often too strong leadership. I mean, you can really end up in a dictatorship at a time of crisis, and look at Germany before World War II. But it sounds like maybe you are seeing us as moving to the left in response.
We'll see. I mean, that's, I think it's pretty, insofar as you define providing healthcare as a right, as a, left program, uh, I think it's pretty obvious that's what we're going to have to do. Whether we're going to be able to combine things like that with other aspects of, um, you know, uh, what's passed for political conventional wisdom or establishment politics is an open question. Like, for example, are we going to be able to combine, a reasonable national health service with spending trillions of dollars on the military, as we've been routinely for generations now, the so-called national security state? A little bit unclear. Are we going to be able to combine it with low rates of taxation on billionaires? Again, kind of unclear. It'll have to be, this program will have to be funded. And we haven't even mentioned like the other crisis that's looming, which is, climate catastrophe. So that's another $1 trillion program that we'll need to find the money from somewhere, or God knows. I mean, will we run or maybe we'll be able to keep low rates of taxation on billionaires, but we'll fund it through deficit spending. Who knows? If we're going to address these crises, somehow we're going to have to finance it in some way. The left solution is that you tax rich people and you cut back on the military. Is that the way we're going to fund it? Well, I can't say I'm certain it's going to happen, but it seems pretty clear to me that both those two things will need to come online within the next 3 or 4 years if we're not going to live in a completely barbaric society, right?
Is it strange to you to feel like now you have a lot of company? You can name your position without having to explain it. There's many people on your side who advocate exactly the same things. You're probably much less alone than you once were in your beliefs. You have a whole
Yeah,
youth movement supporting you. That must be odd.
yeah. It is odd in a way. I think it's more odd that I think young people just assume when they talk to me that like I'm not gonna have the beliefs that they're gonna have to argue with me, that they're gonna have to convince me, that the things that I've been talking about for years and that they're talking about now are, something that they're gonna have to argue with me about. But in fact, that's I think a lot of them are surprised that they don't get arguments from me on certain things. On the other hand, I've been around the block a few times politically. So, for example, like, as you know, Dan, I was an elected official back in New Haven. I was an alderman, but I was elected as a third party alderman. I was a Green Party person. And back then, there was a belief that that's what we needed, or for some of us, we thought that what needed to happen for any of these changes to take place was in the context of a third party. And the Nader candidacies were the first, we thought, were the beginnings of this third party coming into focus, and that it would happen first through local office holders and then ultimately moving up the ranks. Well, it seems to be the case that the model that it will need through which it will happen will be, as Sanders is demonstrating, right, through the Democratic Party, an insurgent, say, revolution within the Democratic Party. And that's kind of now, of course, Sanders lost. So there's the argument that you still encounter, that the Democratic Party is unreformable.
Or not yet ready.
Well, that's the other side. I would say the latter, that in fact what Sanders demonstrated is that there is a potential, right? The fact that he came as close as he did is an indication that that's the model that we're going to have to pursue. Now, you do find the contingent on the left who were making arguments very similar to the arguments that I was making 20 years ago, which is that the Democratic Party is unreformable and you just have to leave it. But I don't, I don't think that's right. I think that, the Sanders model or the Ocasio-Cortez model or the Ilhan Omar model, that's where we have to be doing our organizing. Though it still, could be the case that you have certain kinds of third-party insurgencies that develop from a local base, like Sanders himself, right? He's never been a Democrat. So who knows? There may be people that will get elected locally on a third-party line or nonpartisan line, and they end up running as third-party candidates through higher office. Though I can't say I see many of those happening right now.
Just to set people in time, if they're viewing this video in the future, today is April 26th of 2020. So if you're watching this video in 2021, it's important to know that we don't yet know the outcome of the upcoming election. It's still 6-7 months away.
Right.
Joe Biden has certainly adapted to the times. We hear much more of leaning towards the kind of talk that you're talking, but he's certainly still a moderate Democrat. Is this a candidate that you are willing to support? Can you shift your allegiances over for the sake of this election to him? Do you feel that there's really no difference between Biden and Trump? Where do you stand on this?
Oh, well, this goes back to 2016 when I got in lots of arguments. Well, actually, I wrote a paper with Chomsky, all things about why you needed, at least in swing states, to have voted for Clinton. And I think it's now pretty painfully obvious to everybody why we would have been in a much better place right now had we had a neoliberal Clinton administration rather than a proto-fascist Trump administration. Trivially, you would not have the defunded Center for Disease Control. You would not have the government pulling out of the World Health Organization. You would not have having a president announcing to millions of people on, in his televised briefing that you should be injecting bleach and cleaning products as a cure for the disease. I think it's really pretty insane what we've descended to. Clinton would not have been saying these kinds of things. She would have been appointing competent technocrats to run these government agencies, and we probably would have had a reasonable, though by no means robust, response to the epidemic. It could not have been robust because she was committed, as have generations of neoliberal Democrats, to cutting away basic benefits and the healthcare infrastructure that had been built up generations ago. Democrats are just as complicit in cutting that as Republicans have been. So it wouldn't have been a robust response, but it would have been infinitely, or maybe not infinitely, but substantially preferable to the non-existent response that we've gotten from the current administration. So obviously, that's, you vote for the lesser evil on basic grounds, rational grounds. Less evil is better than more evil, kind of trivially, and that's what Biden represents. The problem that Biden poses is that he may be unelectable because he's a terrible candidate. He's, for one thing, there are credible allegations of sexual assault that have been leveled against him, and Republicans will certainly weaponize those. And he's clearly in a fairly advanced state of cognitive decline, which is why they're keeping him in his basement and out of sight, because maybe he isn't committing Trump level gaffes, but it's clear he's having trouble, putting sentences together. And then there's his long history of neoliberalism, which Trump very effectively weaponized against Clinton in 2016, voting for trade agreements that completely devastated the Midwest economy. And that's what allowed Trump to beat Clinton. He'll try to use it against Biden, though in the context of a, God knows, 20% unemployment rate, which he is to some extent responsible for, it might not work against Biden. And from the polls that I've seen recently, it does look like Biden will be able to use that to his advantage in November, though of course a lot can happen before then.
Barack Obama compared himself to the captain of an aircraft carrier or a huge ship, saying that the president can only change the angle very slowly during the presidency and hope for a more long-term change many years later. Do you think that Donald Trump has disproved that analogy? Has he turned the boat more than a few degrees?
Well, towards barbarism, yes, but in terms of like challenging the basic institutions, not really. He's just degraded them. He certainly has not made rich people any less rich. And in response to Obama, it's certainly true that you can't change the direction of the ship if you appoint Larry Summers to your cabinet, or you appoint Ken Salazar, to be your to the Department of Interior, and oil, and you're not going to be able to change confront the power of the oil industry if that's who you're putting your Secretary of Interior. You're not going to be able to take on the health insurance lobby if you commit at the beginning to rejecting single payer. So certainly, to some extent, that was a prophecy that Obama himself made a reality over the course of his presidency. I don't think it needed to be the case. I don't know if you noticed, but Biden has recently outed himself with saddling himself with Larry Summers as being one of his chief advisors on the economy. So I can't say I'm hopeful that he's going to be able to he's going to change the direction of the ship. But as we were saying before, reality may impose big changes, not what he himself would prefer to do.
Do you think there's a danger in this country as people struggle through unemployment, declining or disappearing savings, and become somewhat desperate? Is there a danger of violence in the country? Do you think we have really, really tough times ahead, or do you think we're going to be able to navigate through this, given the present government and your feelings about those in power now?
I just don't know. I'm sure. I don't know if anybody knows more than I do. I assume people do, but there's prospect for some pretty frightening, experiences. Like these demonstrations in Minnesota and Michigan gave some indication of that, which is to say all these people have guns.
Same right here in Wisconsin.
Did you actually see this yourself, or did you just?
A student of mine saw it. He was jogging and he ran by the Capitol Square and saw armed civilians protesting.
Yeah, that's really frightening. And the other side of that, which is something I can sort of imagine happening even up here, is say food. I don't know if you know. A lot of food production is getting to be, or food production, food distribution is a problem right now. So there are all these farmers that basically have been like plowing their crops into the ground because the networks that they had been plugged into, distribution networks that they had been plugged into, just completely collapsed. Like the ones in particular that had been plugged into the restaurant distribution networks. So, farmers and in Idaho, you see these gigantic train loads of potatoes that they just basically dug gigantic pits and threw them in, or onions, so whether that will have the effect of actually producing significant food shortages in the months to come is definitely an issue. And then the question is, well, what's going to happen when you have these people that have guns and they can't get food? Right? So are they gonna, so like I have a nice backyard garden, that I'm getting ramped up now. It's not totally out of the question to me that 6 months from now, we're gonna have some like local vigilante types that will like show up in my backyard and like decide that they're going to help themselves to my vegetables. That's a little bit of a nightmare scenario. But, we have there's a lot of food production that happens right in my town. There, a lot of the farmers markets for New York City are sourced in this region. And they show up, they harvest their stuff and they bring them down to the food markets in New York. I can well imagine that like people locally will want to get access to that food. And so they will show up on some of these farms and they'll just decide they're going to pick their own vegetables. And so the question is, well, what is the farmer going to do? Is he going to stop those people? I mean, one thing I can imagine him doing is fencing off all that property and then patrolling it if that gets to be a problem. You hear of things like that happening in the Depression, that there were growers, say, in California, that actually had to patrol their property because people were like stealing, like the peaches and the oranges for their own use. Will we get to that point? Who knows? That doesn't seem like that right now, but God knows, 6 months from now, particularly given like the fact that Trump basically and McConnell have decided to basically give everybody a check for $1,200. How long can you live on that? Not long.
So to conclude, are you able to dredge up any kind of optimism in yourself?
Yeah, I mean, at the moment, as we're saying, it just seems to be that the necessity for really fundamental changes is kind of taken for granted for anybody that thinks about these subjects for 2 minutes. Whereas before, you had to harangue somebody for hours of the necessity for changing the system in a pretty fundamental way. Whether we're actually going to be able to institute it is kind of an open question. But I think, the optimism resides in the fact that the potential seems to be there in a way that it was not even just months ago.
Thanks so much for talking with me.
My pleasure. You're good at this.
Thank you.